Nobody in that hangar could explain what they had just witnessed. 22 years, 3 combat deployments. Commander Harlan Voss had watched the best-trained human beings on the planet operate under conditions that would reduce ordinary men to rubble. And in all that time, in all those years of watching talent either rise or collapse under pressure, he had never once been rendered speechless. Not by talent, not by courage, not by anything. Until that Tuesday, a single shooter won confirmed engagement at 4,847 m, a distance that had never been officially recorded in the history of active field operations. Not on a range, not in a controlled environment, in wind, in dust, in the kind of chaos that eats precision for breakfast and spits out excuses. And the shooter was a 26-year-old woman named Sergeant Maya Reyes, who had been carrying a rifle that half the men in that hangar had told her to put down. Nobody in that hangar could answer the question Voss was about to ask. But by the end of this story, you will. If this story grips you from the very first line, consider subscribing and hitting follow so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story reaches across the world. Because stories like Maya's don't just belong to one country. They belong to everyone who has ever been told they don't belong in the room. They told her to put it down before she ever picked it up. That was the thing about the Barrett M82A1 that most people misunderstood. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a statement. Chambered in .50 caliber BMG, 29 pounds unloaded with a muzzle brake the size of a clenched fist and a report that could be felt in the sternum from 100 yards away. It was the kind of rifle that announced itself. It was the kind of rifle that said, whoever is holding me has decided something permanent about their relationship with distance and death. Maya Reyes had decided that relationship when she was 19 years old, standing in a field outside San Marcos, Texas, watching her grandfather shoot a rusted oil drum 800 yards with a rifle that was older than most of the men at the bay she would later be assigned to. He had not missed. He had not adjusted his scope. He had looked at her afterward with eyes that had seen Korea and said something she would not fully understand for another 7 years. Distance is honest. He had told her, everything else lies to you. Distance never does. She had written it in the small leather journal she kept in the left breast pocket of every uniform she had ever worn. Not because she was sentimental, because she was precise, and precision required remembering exactly what truth looked like before the world tried to complicate it. Her grandfather, Master Sergeant Ernesto Reyes, retired, decorated, and deeply controversial in certain circles of the Army's long-range marksmanship community, had left her 3 things when he died of a heart attack during her first week of basic training. The journal, a single letter sealed in a night for scope he had bought with his first re-enlistment bonus in 1971. The reticles still clean, the glass still perfect. She carried all 3. The journal lived in her left breast pocket, pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. The letter had never been opened. The scope was mounted on her Barrett the morning she arrived at the Joint Special Operations Assessment Facility in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, on a gray February morning that smelled like diesel exhaust and wet concrete, with a temperature of 31 degrees and a wind out of the northwest at 12 miles per hour. She noted all of those numbers before she noted the faces of the men staring at her. There were 14 of them, 12 candidates, and 2 evaluators gathered near the equipment check station outside the main briefing structure. They were all built for it. Wide through the shoulder, economical in their movement, the kind of men who had trained their bodies to be tools rather than displays. They were watching her the way people watch something unexpected appear in a familiar place. Not with hostility exactly, but with the kind of flighty assessment that is only 1 degree away from dismissal. The Barrett was slung across her back. At 5 feet 6 inches and 141 pounds, the rifle was nearly 2/3 her body length. She had heard the comment before she even set her bag down. She'd bring that for Shell. It came from a man named Staff Sergeant Derek Callum. 6 feet 2 inches, 220 pounds, with a jaw like a cinder block and a reputation in the close-quarters community that was by any honest measure legitimate. He had 3 confirmed kills at over 800 m from his time in Afghanistan. He was not a bad shot. He simply did not believe that a woman who barely cleared the rifle's own weight threshold had any business holding the weapon that had come to represent the absolute outer edge of what human marksmanship could accomplish. His skepticism was in its own context reasonable. That was what made it dangerous. Maya Reyes did not look at him when he said it. She set her bag down next to the equipment rack, unshouldered the Barrett with practiced economy. The motion fluid contained no wasted gesture, and placed it on the rack with a precision that suggested she had done it 10,000 times, which she had. She then turned to the evaluator, a lean man in his 40s named Chief Warrant Officer Santos, and said 4 words, "Reyes, Sergeant, reporting is ordered." Santos checked his clipboard, looked up, looked at her, looked at the Barrett, made a small mark. "Wind's picking up," he said. "Be ready in 30 minutes. "I've been ready," Ma said, and went to find coffee. The coffee in the briefing room was cold. She drank it anyway. The first day of assessment was not about shooting. It was about patience. The candidates will walk through a 9-hour sequence of scenario briefings, equipment checks, fitness evaluations, and psychological screening designed not to identify the best shooters, but to identify who cracked under boredom and bureaucracy. Because in the world Mayo was trying to enter, the mission was often 9 to 6 hours of absolute stillness and silence before 60 seconds of necessity. The boredom was the test. The paperwork was the test. The cold coffee and the waiting and the 12-hour silence before a shot that had to be perfect. All of it was the test. Maya understood this in a way that most of the other candidates were still learning. She understood it because her grandfather had taught her that the rifle was the least important part of the equation. She had read his journal so many times that she could recite certain passages from memory. There was one she returned to often written in his seal, slightly angular hand during his second tour, when he had been a scout sniper instructor and had watched a generation of talented young men fail not because they couldn't shoot, but because they couldn't wait. He had written, "The rifle will do what you ask. The question is whether you've earned the right to ask. And you earn that right in the hours between the shots, in the patience, in the quiet, in the decision not to act when everything in you is screaming to act. The trigger is the last thing. The discipline is the first." She had underlined that passage in pencil, and she had underlined it again. By the time the first live fire assessment began on day 2, something had shifted in the air of the evaluation range. It was subtle, the kind of shift you felt before you could name it. 2 of the 12 candidates had washed out overnight. One for a medical issue that had been concealed on intake forms, and one for reasons that were never officially stated, but had to do with a comment made to one of the evaluators that no one in the group discussed openly afterward. That left 10 candidates. Maya was the only woman. She was also, at this point, the only one who had not complained about the cold. The range at the JSWA facility was not a standard military range. It was a purpose-built evaluation environment, variable terrain, crosswind generators that could be programmed to simulate specific geographic conditions, multiple target arrays at distances from 300 m to, on the far end, a theoretical maximum of 2,200 m. The practical test for this first live fire assessment was set at 800 m. Standard military doctrine considered confirmed engagements at that distance to be elite-level work. Maya considered 800 m to be a warm-up. She did not say this. She chambered around, adjusted for the wind, 14 miles per hour by now, gusting from a northwest at approximately 15 degrees off perpendicular, and waited. Her heart rate, measured by the biometric monitoring equipment all candidates wore, was 52 beats per minute. The next lowest candidate was at 68. The target appeared, a standard IPSC silhouette, at 812 m, not 800. They had moved it slightly to test whether candidates were rearranging or assuming. 3 candidates shot immediately, working from the brief distance. 2 of them missed because they had not rearranged. Maya's heart rate dropped to 49. She rearranged, confirmed 812. Adjusted, exhaled to the natural respiratory pause. That half second between exhale and the next inhale when the body is briefly, perfectly still and fired. The round hit the center of the silhouette 3 in from geometric center. Santos noted it without expression, but Callum who was standing 2 positions to her left and had also hit his target correctly to his credit, turned and looked at her with something that was not yet respect, but was no longer entirely dismissal. It was the first stage of something. She didn't notice because she was already thinking about the wind shifting. It was going to shift in approximately 4 minutes. She could feel it in the way the dust moved at the base of the berm. Not a steady push, but a rotation. The air turning on itself the way it did before change in direction. Her grandfather had taught her to read it. Not with instruments, though instruments helped. With Huff faced with her hands with the part of the brain that if you trained it long enough stopped being a brain and became something closer to an antenna. She waited for minutes later. The wind changed direction. The next target appeared. She adjusted for the new angle, fired, and hit the center again. Santos wrote something longer on his clipboard this time. After the assessment, walking back to the equipment shed, Callum fell into step beside her. He said nothing for several seconds, which she recognized as a specific kind of communication. "Where'd you learn to read wind like that?" He finally asked. "San Marcos," she said. "Texas, my grandfather." Callum was quiet again. "Then he military Korea?" she said. "Scouts." He nodded slowly. The kind of nod that means more than agreement. It means recalibration. She put the Barrett on the rack and began the cleaning process with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. Barrel brush first, then patch. The solvent smelled sharp and clean in the cold air. Behind her, she heard Callum tell someone else something she wasn't supposed to hear, but did she knows what she's doing? Small victory. She noted it the way she noted wind speed as a data point. Useful, but not the story. The story was still coming. She could feel it the way she felt weather. It was out there past the visible horizon, moving toward her at a speed she couldn't yet calculate. But she would be ready. She was always ready. The preparation was everything. The rifle was the last thing. Her grandfather had been controversial for a reason that the official record described in careful, bloodless language as an unauthorized engagement, resulting in a confirmed civilian casualty with subsequent intelligence revision. What that meant in plain language was this. In the winter of 1951, outside a village called Changshan, Corporal Ernesto Reyes had taken a shot that no one had authorized him to take at a target, no one had identified as a priority at a distance, no standard scout doctrine considered within operational parameters. He had hit a man in a civilian overcoat who had been standing on a ridge for 11 minutes with a field telephone pressed to his A. The immediate response from his commanding officer had been fury. The subsequent review had found that the man with the telephone had been a Chinese artillery coordinator and that the village behind the ridge had contained, unknown to anyone in Corporal Reyes' battalion, a forward aid station where 43 wounded American soldiers were being treated. The artillery strike those coordinates would have called in had been, according to later analysis, 7 minutes away. The 43 men lived. The unauthorized shot became the center of a debate that ran through the Army's marksmanship community for decades afterward. A debate not about whether the outcome had been good, but about whether a young corporal with a rifle had any business making that call on his own. Ernesto Reyes had always said he did. Not loudly, not often, but when he said it in a specific way that cut through argument. The rifle doesn't know doctrine. He had told Maya when she was 15, sitting on the porch in San Marcos with the Texas heat pressing down on everything. The rifle knows distance. The rest is just paperwork that hasn't been written yet. There were people in the Army who had loved him for that, and people who had never forgiven him for it. One of those people, though Maya had not yet discovered this, was indirectly responsible for what was about to happen to her career, her mission, and the mission that existed beneath the mission she had been officially given. But that discovery was still 12 days away. Right now, in the equipment shed at Fort Bragg, smelling of solvent and cold metal, she cleaned her rifle with the methodical care of someone who understood that precision began in maintenance, not in execution. The night forescope gleamed under the fluorescent light. She checked the reticle, confirmed the zero, ran her thumb along the turret caps with a touch that was almost unconscious, a habit so deep it had become instinct. In the left breast pocket of her jacket, pressed against her ribs, the journal was warm from her body heat. Distance is honest. Everything else lies to you. Distance never does. She closed the equipment case, latched it, and went to find dinner. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the wind picking up again. She noted the direction, noted the speed, waited to see what it was bringing with it. 12 days later, the air in Commander Voss's office smelled like old paper and machine oil, which told Ma two things about the man before he spoke. He had been in this business long enough that his environment had absorbed it, and he maintained his own equipment, which meant he trusted his own judgment more than he trusted institutional supply chains. Both observations were, she would learn, accurate. Harlan Voss was 51 years old, built like a man who had been strong in his youth, and had simply remained so through habit rather than vanity. He had gray-green eyes and a way of going still when he was listening that reminded Maya of the pause between exhale and inhale, that brief, perfect moment of suspension. He was one of the most decorated special operations officers currently serving in an active command capacity, and he had reviewed her file for 40 minutes before she walked in, which she knew because his secretary had told her the appointment had been pushed twice. He looked at her then at the Barrett case she had carried in under one arm. "Sergeant Reyes," he said, "Sir, sit down." "She's Saturday." He looked at the Barrett case again. The same look Callum had given it on the first day, but different in a way she couldn't immediately categorize. Not dismissal, not challenge, something more complex. An assessment that included variables she wasn't aware of yet. "You're aware," he said, "that your assessment scores were unusual." "I'm aware of my scores, sir. The wind reading is what they're talking about." He leaned back slightly. "Santos said you called a direction change 4 minutes before it happened. He asked you about it afterward." "Yes, sir." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I read it in the dust movement at the base of the BAM." Vuz was quiet for a moment. "And what would you tell me if I asked you the same question?" Maya considered. "I'd tell you the same thing. And then I'd tell you that my grandfather taught me the dust reading, and that it took 5 years before I trusted it over instruments, and another 2 years before the instruments confirmed that the method was reliable to within a 12-second margin." Vuz almost smiled. "Almost." "Ernesto Reyes," he said. Not a question. Something moved through her chest. Not quite surprise. Something more ceiling file. He looked at her steadily. "The Army considers that engagement operationally archived. Some people consider it a masterclass. Others consider it the example they use to argue against autonomous field judgment." He paused. "Your scores suggest you inherited his instincts." "I inherited his scope." She said, "The instincts I had to own." Voss was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "There's a mission. I'm going to tell you about it. And before I do, I need to know one thing." "Sir, have you ever been to Kerala province?" She had not. She told him so. The elevation averages 2,100 m. The temperature variance between dawn and midday can be 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind patterns are local, complex, and unpredictable by standard meteorological modeling beyond a 40-minute window. He set a folder on the desk between them. The target is a logistics coordinator named Farik Nazarov. He is responsible for the movement of a specific category of equipment through a corridor that has cost us in the last 18 months 22 lives. He let that number sit. He moves constantly. He has been confirmed at a fixed location exactly twice in 14 months. Our intelligence suggests he will be at that location again in 11 days. Maya looked at the folder, but did not open it. "What's the distance?" Vuz looked at her. "That's what you want to know first. It's the only number that changes what's possible." He opened the folder himself and turned a page toward her. She looked at the number without expression. 4,847 m. Silence. Not the silence of shock. The silence of calculation. "Current record," he said, "for confirmed operational engagement. Not range, not controlled environment is 2,475 m. Canadian JDF 2, 2017. He watched her face. "You're looking at nearly double that." "I know the record," she said. "The question isn't whether you can hit the target," Voss said carefully. "The question is whether anyone in current operational conditions with available equipment can confirm the shot and maintain mission security from that distance without being compromised. The shot is manageable." Ma said, "Given specific conditions." "Which conditions?" "I need the topographic survey data, the atmospheric modeling for that window, and 48 hours at elevation before the engagement to understand the local thermal variance." She looked at him steadily, and I'd need Callum on observation. Voss raised an eyebrow. You want Callum? He's the best spotter in the assessment group, and he doesn't like me, which means he'll challenge every call I make and make me prove each one. She paused. That's what I want out there. Someone who's going to be hard on me, not someone who's going to be polite and get me killed. For the first time, Voss looked at her with something that was not assessment, something warmer, something that carried recognition in it. The way old music carries memory. Your grandfather said almost exactly that, he said quietly. In the Chennaion debrief, word for word, Maya said nothing. Her hand beneath the table pressed briefly against her left breast pocket. The journal was there, warm, solid, distance is honest. Voss closed the folder. You have 11 days, Sergeant. Let's talk about what the 11 days look like. She nodded. Outside the window, the wind had changed direction. She had felt it changed 3 minutes ago. She noted it, said nothing, listened. The mission that was officially described to her in the next 40 minutes was precise, limited, and clay. A single high-V value target, a single confirmed window, a single shot at a distance that had never been attempted in operational conditions. What Voss did not tell her, because she would later understand he did not yet know himself, was the mission beneath the mission. The one that had been running for 3 years before she arrived. The one that had a face she would eventually recognize. The one that connected in a way that should have been impossible to a dead Korean War corporal in a leather journal and a shot taken without authorization outside a village called Chongjin in 1951. She would not know any of that for another 6 days, but she would feel it. The way she felt weather, the way she felt wind, something out there past the visible horizon moving toward her. The man who would become the mission beneath the mission had a name that most of the people who worked with him had mispronounced for years. His name was Colonel Raymond Ashby. He was 63 years old, had spent 38 of those years in the Army's intelligence apparatus, and had the kind of face that was professionally forgettable, medium height, medium build, the sort of features that neither attracted nor repelled attention. He wore his rank with the slight embarrassment of a man who had been promoted for paperwork rather than performance. And he had perfected the bureaucratic art of being present without being visible. He had also for 11 years been accepting payments from a network of arms brokers and logistics intermediaries whose activities in Central Asia had resulted in, among other consequences, the death of 22 people whose names appeared in a file in Commandr Voss's office. One of the intermediaries in that network was Farik Nazarov. Ash knew that file existed. He knew about the mission. He had been briefed on it because his position in the intelligence oversight structure required him to be briefed on it. And in the week before, Maya Reyes and Derek Callum were due to insert into Cali province. He had made 3 phone calls from a personal device that he believed was clean. It was not, but he did not know that yet. And his not knowing was a thread that would eventually, in the hands of the right person, become a rope. Mia did not yet know about Ashp. She was on the morning of day 6 before insertion, lying in a shallow depression in the training terrain at Fort Bragg at 4:17 in the morning with her body temperature 4 degrees below comfortable and a light rain falling that had soaked through the second layer of her gear approximately 90 minutes ago. She was not thinking about Colonel Ashp. She was thinking about thermals. Specifically, she was thinking about the thermal gradient in Kerala province at dawn. The way cold air pulled in the valleys and pushed upward as the sun heated the rock faces, creating a vertical movement that would interact with a horizontal wind to produce a 3-dimensional ballistic environment that no standard external ballistic software had ever been designed to model. She was thinking about how to solve for it, not algorithmically, not theoretically, physically, with her body in the air and her face reading what the instruments couldn't tell her in time. Callum was 6 feet to her left, his own body flat in the same depression, rain dripping from the bill of his cap. He had been quieter than usual for 3 days ever since she had told Voss she wanted him on observation. She had not explained why beyond what she had said in that office. And Callum, to his credit, had not asked. Reyes, he said, barely audible, his breath making a small cloud in the cold. Callum, you think about the thermal layers yet for the insertion window? I've been thinking about nothing else for 6 days. A pause. Rain. The sound of it on cold leaves. What's your model? I don't have one yet, she said. That's the problem then. What do you have? A hypothesis. She shifted slightly, feeling the wet ground against her shoulder. The rock faces on the north side of the ridge gained temperature faster than the valley floor because of the aspect angle to the sun at that latitude in March, which means the thermal updraft will start from the north face and move south, which means the wind data from the last 48 hours, which runs east-west across the corridor, is going to interact with a vertical component that won't appear in any forecasting model because it's too local and too dependent on the specific rock mass. Callum was quiet for a moment. You're going to have to feel it. Yes. Another pause. How long? 48 hours at elevation before the window. She said minimum. I need to watch the air move over that specific terrain in real light and dark cycles before I can model it well enough to correct for it. That's a long time to be at elevation in Kerala. I know. Insertion window opens in 11 days. If we're at elevation 48 hours before the shot, that means day 9 insertion, she said. Instead of day 11, he absorbed this. Voss knows. Voss will know when I tell him. Callum said nothing for a long moment. Rain, cold, the sound of a branch somewhere in the dark above them moving in a wind she had felt coming 6 minutes ago. Your grandfather was a scout, he said finally. Yes. In Korea. Yes, the changing thing. He paused. I read the file when I heard your name on the candidate list. She turned her head slightly. In the dark, she could see the outline of his profile. Jaw, nose, the still line of his mouth. What did you think of it? I thought it was one of the most technically precise decisions made under an authorized conditions in the history of long-range engagement. He paused. I also thought the Army had every right to be angry about it. Those two things aren't contradictory, she said. No, he agreed. They are not. Another pause. I also thought about how a man who made that shot at that range with 1951 optics and no computer support managed to understand a tactical situation in 11 minutes that an entire battalion had missed for 3 days. Ma said nothing. He was reading the air. Callum said quietly. It wasn't a question. He was reading everything. She said the pattern, the 11 minutes with a telephone instead of 10 or 12 the angle of the ridge, the direction of the wire. She paused. He used to say that a shot is the last thing you do. Everything before it is the work. Callum absorbed this. Above them, the rain lightened slightly. She felt the barometric pressure shifting. When you said you wanted me on observation, he said you said it was because I challenge you. That's right. That's not the only reason. She looked at him. You want someone who will tell you when you're wrong, he said. Not someone who will agree with you. Yes. Most people want the opposite. Most people want to feel good about their decisions, she said. I want my decisions to be correct. Callum was quiet for a very long time after that. Long enough that she thought he had finished speaking. Then we insert day 9. Day 9, she confirmed. He said nothing else, but she heard in that silence the second stage of something that had begun on day 1 of the assessment when he had told someone she knew what she was doing. She filed it away, noted it the way she noted air pressure and temperature change as a data point, as something that might matter. Later, when the variables converged. Later, she would understand that it was the most important data point of the entire mission. But that was still 6 days away, and there was something else coming first. On day 7 before insertion, she found the mirror. She had not been looking for it. She had been in the secure communications room reviewing the last 6 months of signals intelligence related to Nazara's movement patterns, searching for the behavioral regularity that every human being eventually reveals if you watch them long enough and carefully enough. Because no one, no matter how trained, no matter how disciplined, ever fully escapes the gravity of habit. She was looking for a pattern in Nerev's movement timing. She found it, a 19-hour rest cycle that correlated with elevation changes, suggesting that he or someone in his immediate protection detail had altitude sickness that constrained their operational pace. She noted it, confirmed it against 3 separate data points, and was about to close the file when she saw a name in the signals traffic that she had not expected to see. The name was Marcus Droy. She sat with it for a moment, said nothing. Let the cold fact of it settle into her the way cold water settles into wet ground. Slowly, completely finding every gap. Marcus Droy had been her grandfather's last student. A prodigy by all accounts. The most naturally talented long-range shooter Ernesto Reyes had ever trained, which was saying something because her grandfather had trained 6 to 7 students in his post-service career as a civilian marksmanship instructor and had described exactly 4 of them as genuinely gifted. Droy had been, in his words, the one who frightens me a little. He had also 11 years ago been dishably discharged from the army after a classified incident in Central Asia that the public record described as conduct unbecoming and the rumor record described as something more specific and more damning. A refusal to take a shot that would have ended a specific mission followed by a private arrangement with a surviving party that had benefits that were not institutional. In other words, he had been paid to miss in the signal traffic in front of her. His name appeared in a communication 3 months old between a logistics intermediary in Tashkent and a coordination address that flagged as active, meaning someone at that address was still receiving and responding. The coordination address resolved to a location in Cali province. She sat very still for 4 to 7 seconds. Then she pulled up everything the system had on Decroix's last known location, last known contact, and last known operational role. What she found took her an hour to fully absorb and another hour to verify. Marcus Dacroix was in Cali province had been for 8 months. He was working according to the signals intelligence as a security coordinator for Nazarov's network, providing advanced surveillance route assessment, and the file implied, but did not state directly counter-sniper assessment for anyone who might be trying to do what Mayor Reyes had just been asked to do. He was the best long-range shooter her grandfather had ever trained. He was now the primary security obstacle standing between her and a target. And he had been trained using the same methods, the same philosophy, the same journal. Her grandfather had read from it aloud during training sessions. She knew that from the students she had spoken to over the years that she had been trained with. He knew everything she knew. He would see everything she saw. And he had 8 months of local knowledge that she was still trying to build in 6 days. She closed the file, sat in the silence of the communications room with a hum of equipment around her and the weight of the journal in her left breast pocket, and thought for the first time in this process about something other than wind correction and distance calculation. She thought about betrayal, not as an emotion, as a data point. Her grandfather had written about it once in the journal in a passage she had not thought about in years. She found it now, by touch, almost her fingers finding the page without looking. The way they found the trigger guard of the Barrett without needing to see it. He had written, "The student who surpasses you is the measure of your teaching. The student who turns against you is the measure of the world's imperfection. Neither is a reflection of your worth. Both are a reflection of your responsibility." She read it twice, put the journal back, went to find Voss. The conversation with Voss lasted 2 hours and 23 minutes, and it changed the shape of the mission in ways that Maya would spend the next 4 days calibrating for, not physically, but strategically, which was the harder calibration. Voss had known about Dacroix. She had suspected this from the SEAL practice steadiness with which he received the information she brought him. A steadiness that was slightly too prepared, slightly too immediate to be genuine discovery. He had known. He had not told her. She asked him why. "Because I wanted to see if you'd find it yourself," he said. "And I wanted to see what you'd do with it when you did. And you came to me instead of keeping it to yourself." He looked at her. That was the answer I was hoping for. She absorbed this. Is the counter-sniper element? Almost certainly. He'll set up on the ridge opposite, the only viable approach angle from my position. He knows the doctrine. He was trained in it. Yes, he'll be expecting a shot from the east approach because the east approach is the only line that gives the geometry for that distance. He'll be watching the east approach. Voss nodded slowly. He was seeing where this was going. "I'm not going to use the east approach," she said. Voss was quiet. "The north-ace approach adds 600 m to the total engagement distance." 4,847, she said. "Not 4,200. Silence. "The north-ace approach also puts you in the thermal gradient you've been trying to model," he said carefully. "You'd be shooting through 3 distinct air layers with different temperature and density profiles." "I know, which means your correction model needs to account for all 3 simultaneously." "I know, which means he stopped. 48 hours at elevation isn't enough. It'll have to be she said, because the alternative is letting Droy see me coming, and if he sees me coming, this doesn't work. Voss looked at her for a long moment. The gray-green, eyes very still. Your grandfather made an unauthorized call in Chang'an because the authorized approach would have failed. Yes, she said. You're describing something similar. No, sir. She looked at him steadily. I'm describing the authorized approach. I'm just telling you that the authorized approach requires accepting a set of conditions that the initial mission parameters didn't account for. The distinction mattered. She could see from his expression that he understood why she was drawing it. He was also, she realized, testing her on exactly that distinction. The line between the unauthorized act and the authorized act performed outside the expected parameters. The same line her grandfather had walked in 1951. The same line that had defined his entire legacy and the debate that followed it. Boss walked to the window. The light outside was the flat gray of late afternoon in February. The kind of light that made everything look like it was waiting for something. There's one more thing, she said. He turned to signals traffic. I found Droy in. She paused. The coordination address, he was communicating with it, resolved to a location. A contact address. Voss waited. The contact address is domestic, she said, for Bragg Installation Network. The silence that followed was of a specific quality, the kind that exists when something that has been suspected for a long time is finally named aloud. Ise was sight. His voice was perfectly level. I can run the resolution forward, she said. I'll need access to. I'll handle it, he said. Something moved across his face. Not anger exactly, but the compressed version of anger that experienced men carry when they have been proved right about something they wish they'd been wrong about. You focus on the mission, Sergeant. Day 9 insertion. Northeast approach. He paused and re-is. Sir, don't tell Callum about Delacroix. She looked at him. Not because I don't trust him, Voss said quickly. Because I need you to make the approach decision based on the tactical reality, not on Callum's reaction to the name. He paused. Dilroy and Callum trained together. 2 years Callum needs to be focused on observation, not on processing something personal. Maya considered this. It was, she acknowledged, a reasonable tactical decision. It was also the decision that would almost cost her everything on the North Face approach. 6 days later, when Callum, processing everything with his own eyes in real time, would realize what he was seeing and have approximately 3 seconds to make a choice. But that was 6 days away right now. She said, understood, sir. And she wouldn't find food and sleep because the body needed maintenance the same way the rifle needed maintenance. And because in 4 days she would begin the process of lying completely still for extended periods at 2,100 m of elevation in March conditions in Cali province, waiting for a window that would exist for approximately 40 seconds. 40 seconds. One shot. Nearly 5 kilometers of complex air, and somewhere on a ridge opposite, the only wrong approach. The best student her grandfather had ever taught was going to be watching for her. She pressed the journal against her ribs through the fabric of her jacket. Felt its weight. Felt its warmth. Distance is honest. Everything else lies to you. She would find out in 6 days exactly how true that was. Day 90430 hours. The air at the insertion point smelled like cold rock and something beneath it. Older mineral. The smell of a place that had been high and dry for 10,000 years and had no particular interest in the people moving through it. Maya noticed it the way she noticed everything, filed it, attached it to the growing sensory map of this place that she had been building since the intelligence briefing, adding the real data over the model data, correcting the model with each breath. The helicopter had dropped them 4 kilometers from the base of the North Face, which meant they had 4 kilometers of approach terrain to cover before they reached the bottom of the ridge, and another 900 m of elevation gain after that before they reached the position she had marked on the topographic survey. In the dark, in silence, with a combined equipment load, Barrett, the optics case, the ballistics equipment, the thermal gear, the food and water for 9 to 6 hours that totaled 61 pounds distributed between her pack and Callum's. Callum carried the sputtercope and the meteorological sensor array. She carried everything else. They moved without words. The terrain was loose shale in the lowest section, which required a specific gait. Weight forward, Short steps, each foot placed with deliberate care to avoid the slide that would send stone tumbling down the hillside and announce their position to anyone who was listening. In March in Kerala province at 0430, there was no ambient noise to cover small sounds. The silence was absolute and crisp and carried everything. She moved the way her grandfather had taught her to move in the field, not like a soldier, like a feature of the landscape, like something that had always been there. Callum matched her pace exactly. She noticed this and noted it as data. He was not just following her. He was reading her movement and calibrating his own against it, which meant his situational awareness was running on the same frequency as his. Good. They would need that in the next 48 hours. The climb took 4 hours and 17 minutes. At the position, a natural depression in the rock face at 1,983 m of elevation, partially sheltered by an outcrop that provided concealment from 3 of the 4 possible observation angles. She sat down the pack and spent the first 11 minutes simply lying still and listening, not checking equipment, not surveying through optics, just listening to the air, feeling the temperature on her face, noting the direction and character of the wind, which at this hour, at this elevation, was moving in a slow, almost meditative northward drift that she did not trust because she knew from the 2 days of atmospheric data she had reviewed that it would change completely at first light when the sun began to heat the south-facing rock walls below her position. Callum lay 2 feet to her right. He did not ask why they were waiting. He knew why. The wind shifted at 0712. She felt it before it happened. The brief, almost imperceptible drop in mint that preceded a directional change like a hell breath. Then it came a slight clockwise rotation. The air that had been moving north, bending eastward, and beneath it, rising from the warming rock below. The first suggestion of the thermal updraft. She had hypothesized. She was correct about its origin. It came from a north face, pushed south, but its vertical component was larger than she had modeled. Not dramatically, perhaps 12% above her projection, but at nearly 5 kilometers of horizontal distance. A 12% error in the vertical component of a thermal gradient would produce a point of impact deviation at the target that she needed to recalculate for. She did the math in her head, checked it, did it again. Then she turned to Callum and said very quietly, "I need you to log the thermal gradient data every 20 minutes starting now. Full sensor array. Don't round anything." "Copy," he said, and began setting up the array without further comment. For the next 48 hours, they did not speak unless it was necessary. They ate cold rations, drank water in measured sips, and rotated their observation and rest cycles in 90-minute intervals, one watching, one in a shallow sleep state that never fully disconnected from the environment. It was a skill that took years to develop. The ability to rest the body without switching off the awareness, to exist in a state of suspended readiness that the body could sustain for extended periods without the degradation that came from full sleep deprivation. Ma was better at it than most. Her grandfather had called it the between state, and he had written about it in the journal in terms that had sounded mystical when she was 19 and sound entirely physiological to her now. He had written, "The rifleman who cannot rest in the field is a rifleman who will be tired when it matters. Learn to sleep the way an animal sleeps. Present, aware, one layer below, conscious. The body knows how to do this. You have to trust it enough to let it." She trusted it. She let it. The 48 hours were not uneventful. At 22 hours into their position, she saw the scope flash. It was Callum who almost said the name. He had the sputter scope up, running a routine survey of the opposing ridgeline. The east ridge, the one she had specifically not positioned herself on, the one that the doctrine said was the only viable approach angle for an engagement at this distance. When he went completely still, not the trained stillness of a professional, the involuntary stillness of recognition. She was watching him when it happened. She had been watching him with a peripheral attention she kept on everything, not focused, just present. And she saw his jaw tighten and his grip on the scope increase fractionally, and the color leave the area just below his temple in a way that had nothing to do with cold. "Callum," she said very quietly. His jaw tightened further. "There's a position on the east ridge," he said. His voice was completely level. Too level, the levelness of active control, 300 m below the crest line. Natural rock shelf. Perfect concealment from ground level. I see it, she said. The scope flash was from a modified Night Force mount. He paused. Custom modification. I've seen it once before. She said nothing. Reyes. His voice dropped further. Who else knows we're here? Nobody who would set up on that ridge to help us, she said. Silence. The wind moved over them with its now familiar character. The northward drift transitioning to the eastward bend at regular intervals. The thermal updraft rising from below like slow breathing. He's going to be watching the east approach. She said, I know. A pause. Reyes. Is this he stopped? Started again. Voss knew. Voss knew about the counter-sniper element. She said carefully, he wanted your focus on observation. Callum was quiet for 8 full seconds. She watched his hands. They were still, not naturally still. The stillness of a man using everything he had to keep them that way. How long has he been out there? He asked finally. 8 months at least. Another pause. Longer. He was trained from the same material I was trained from, she said. Same doctrine, same methods. He'll be expecting the approach I didn't take. He'll also be expecting, if he's as good as I think he is, that whoever they sent might know he's there. Callum pulled back slightly from the scope, turned to look at her directly. His eyes were steady, but there was something behind them that was not tactical analysis, something older and more personal. He knows you're coming from the north face. He might suspect it. He knows, Callum said flatly. If he knows who they sent, and he has 8 months of intelligent sourcing out here, he knows that the only person in the current operational pool who would think to use the north-east thermal approach is someone who was trained by the same. He stopped. She waited. You were trained by the same person he was trained by. Callum said, not an accusation, a recognition. Yes, she said. The silence between them held the weight of something neither of them named directly. The weight of legacy misused the weight of a dead man's philosophy in the hands of someone who had taken it and bent it toward a different purpose. What's your plan for him? Callum asked. He can't engage me from that position without exposing himself. She said the geometry doesn't work. His line of sight to my position requires him to move. And if he moves, he breaks concealment. And if he breaks concealment, he knows you're watching. He knows I'm watching. She confirmed. Which means he can't move without signaling his presence, and he can't stay in that position without being blind to my actual firing line. She paused. He's pinned. Callum absorbed this. He knows he's pinned. Yes. Which means he's waiting for you to make a mistake. Yes. What mistake? Rushing. She said under time pressure is going to bet that I rush. Callum looked at her. Will you? She looked back at him. What do you think? He held her gaze for a moment, then turned back to the scope. Log thermal data, she said. 20-minute intervals. Copy, he said, and they settled back into the silence of the mountain and the wind. 26 hours before the engagement window, she found the second thing. She had been cycling through the sensor data, barometric pressure, temperature gradient at 50 m elevation intervals, wind vector logs, when she noticed a pattern in the atmospheric readings that did not match the model she had been building. A micro variation in the temperature gradient at approximately 800 m above her position, appearing consistently at intervals of approximately 40 minutes. Too regular to be random, too specific to be noise. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the topographic map, found the feature at 800 m above her position on the north ridge. A narrow chimney formation in the rock, a gap perhaps 3 m wide running vertically through the rock face, oriented east to west. During the day, when the sun heated the west face of the chimney, the temperature differential between the lit and shaded walls would create a microconvection current inside the chimney that would exhaust into the free air above at regular intervals, approximately every 40 minutes, and propagate downwind in a thin, dense pulse of warm air. Warm air was less dense. Less dense air had lower refractive index. Lower refractive index meant a slight but measurable change in how the light-based range-finding system would read distance through it. It also meant, and this was the part that made her close her eyes for 3 seconds and breathe, that if the engagement window coincided with one of those 40-minute warm air pulses, her ballistic solution would be wrong by a margin that she could calculate but could not correct for in real time. Because the pulse lasted approximately 90 seconds, and she had no way of seeing it coming with her current sensor placement, she needed to know when the next pulse was coming and the next, and the one after that. She needed to time the engagement window to the 40-minute cycle. The engagement window was 40 seconds long, determined by Nazaro's movement pattern and the sight lines from her position. The warm pulse was 90 seconds long. If the window opened during a pulse, she would need to wait out. But there was no room in the 40-second window to wait 90 seconds, which meant she needed the window to open in the 35-minute gap between pulses, which meant she needed to know with precision when the next pulse cycle began. She turned to Callum. The temperature spikes in the gradient data. Can you see the chimney formation on the north ridge from your current position? He looked barely. Northeast, approximately 40 degrees. I need you to watch it. When the sun moves past the chimney apex, log the exact second you see turbulence in the air exhaust. It'll look like heat shimmer. Very brief. Exact second. Callum understood immediately. She could see it in the way he adjusted his scope angle without asking why. How close does the timing have to be to the second? She said, copy. She returned to the sensor data and began the recalculation. The model she had been building for 2 days now had a new variable. It changed nothing fundamental, but it changed the timing of everything, which in this context was the same as changing everything. The countdown, which had been abstract 11 days reduced to 2 days reduced to the engagement window, now became specific and physiological, not clock time, chimney time. The 40-minute pulse of warm air exhaled from a crack in a mountain in Kerala province that no meteorological model had ever mapped. She was grateful for it. The more specific the constraint, the more precise the solution. Her grandfather had written something about this too. Of course, he had a problem with too many variables is not a harder problem. It is a poorly defined problem. When you define it precisely enough, it becomes simple, not easy, simple. She had underlined that passage 3 times over 3 separate readings, each time understanding it differently. Right now, she understood it as permission. Permission to make the problem as specific as it needed to be. Regardless of how complicated that looked from the outside, she checked the Barrett, ran her thumb along the turret caps. The night for scope, her grandfather's scope, the one he had bought with his first re-enlistment bonus, caught the thin, cold light of the high-altitude morning and held it. She checked the sealed letter in her breast pocket, still there, still sealed. She had not opened it in 7 years. She did not open it now, but she held it for a moment through the fabric, the way you hold something that is both weight and anchor. Then she let go of it and looked downrange. 15 hours. Callum logged the chimney exhaust pulse at 14 hours 22 minutes before the window. Exact second 14:22 and 4:1. She calculated the cycle, set the anchor time, built the 40-minute interval forward to the engagement window. The window would open based on Nazarov pattern confirmed by 3 independent behavioral analyses between 15:30 and 16:10 local time. Approximately 40 seconds of exposure as he crossed the open courtyard of the compound from the east structure to the vehicle shelter. The chimney pulse cycle running forward from Callum's logged exhaust event would produce a pulse at 15:41. Duration 90 seconds, which meant the pulse would run from 15:41 to 15:43, which fell inside the window. If Nazarov crossed during that 90 seconds, she would need to wait him out and hope he paused, which the behavioral data suggested he sometimes did, a 3 to 5 second stop at the courtyard center when he checked his phone. 3 to 5 seconds was not enough. She needed the pulse to Clay. If he crossed outside that 90 seconds, either in the first 11 minutes of the window or in the final 18, the air would be clean. She set the chimney pulse as her primary countdown. Everything else subordinated to it. 13 hours, 12:10. They retated rest cycles. She ate a ration bar. She tasted not at all and drank water in careful measured sips. Her heart rate, measured by the wrist monitor she wore, set at 4 to 6 beats per minute. Callum sat at 59. He was working hard to keep it there. She could see him doing it. The deliberate breathing, the conscious unclenching of his hands every 20 minutes. He was good. He was managing. But he was also, she knew, thinking about the scope flash on the East Ridge. About the man behind it. About a training relationship that had nothing to do with this mission and everything to do with it. At hour 11 in the darkest part of the night, he spoke. Reyes Callum. If he sends a communication during or after, he won't, she said. If he does, she was quiet for a moment. Tell me what you're actually asking. A pause. I'm asking if you've made peace with what tomorrow is. She considered the question in its full weight. Not the tactical version, the actual version. I made peace with the mission, she said. That's not what I asked. She looked at the dark sky above the rock outcrop. The stars at this elevation were very close and very cold and very numerous. The kind of stars you only saw above a certain altitude. Too far from any city light to be diluted. Too high for any moisture to soften them. Hard stars. Precise stars. My grandfather made a shot that some people spent 40 years arguing about. She said he never argued about it. He knew what the shot was. He knew what it wasn't. She paused. I know what the shot is, and I know what it isn't. Callum was quiet for a long time. What is it? It's 22 names, she said. That's what it is. Silence. And Dilcroix, he asked softly. Dilcroix made his choice. She said, I can only make mine. After that, neither of them spoke again until morning. The stars went out one by one, replaced by the cold gray approach of a March dawn in Cali province. The thermal gradient shifted. The wind began its rotation. Below them, invisible in the distance, a compound sat in the morning light. And in it, a man named Nazarov was, according to the behavioral pattern, finishing his morning routine in preparation for the movement across the courtyard that he had made 6 times in the 14 months that the intelligence apparatus had been watching him. This would be the 7th time. There would not be an 8th. 0900 hours. 6 hours before the window, Callum logged the second chimney pulse. She noted the exact second, confirmed the cycle interval, 40 minutes, 2 seconds variance, well within the margin, and updated her timing model. She then spent the next 3 hours doing something that looked from the outside like nothing. She lay completely still. She breathed. She let her mind travel the distance between her position and the target. All 4,847 m of it. And she modeled every layer of air the round would pass through, not algorithmically, but experientially, the way a sailor learns a channel by running it in different conditions until the knowledge lives in the body rather than the chart. She thought about the first thermal layer, the dense cold air sitting in the valley floor, approximately 300 m thick, through which the round would pass in the first fraction of a second of flight. She thought about the transition zone above it where the cold valley air met the warmer air coming down from the sun-heated ridge faces. She thought about the mid-range corridor, the long, relatively stable section between 3,500 m of horizontal distance where the round would spend the majority of its flight time and where the east-west wind would have its primary effect. She thought about the terminal approach, the last 1,300 m, where the round would be decelerating through air that was warmer and slightly less dense than the mid-range corridor, and where the chimney pulse could, if timed wrong, push it fractionally high. She thought about the exact position on Nazarov's chest where the round needed to arrive, not approximately. Exactly, she felt in the course of this meditation, because that was the correct word for what it was. The shape of the solution clarify, not complete itself, not resolve into certainty, but clarify. The way a photographic image clarifies in the developing chemical, the detail emerging from noise gradually and then all at once. She knew the shot. She had always known the shot. She had simply been confirming it. At noon, Callum touched her shoulder. Barely a tap, not a grab. She opened her eyes. Something on the east ridge, he said. She took the spot cope, looked. The position on the east ridge had changed. Not vacated, changed. Dilroy had moved approximately 40 m north along the rock shelf, which gave him a slightly different angle. An angle that she realized as she traced the geometry gave him a partial line of sight to something he had not been able to see from his original position. Not to her. She was still below his line from the new position. To Callum, She felt it before she thought it. The cold understanding moving through her faster than analysis. "Is not watching from me," she said. Callum went very still. "He knows he can't see me from that ridge," she said. "His move to see you." She calculated the geometry from his new position. "He has a partial window to your spot cope. He can't get me, but he can force you to move. And if you move, I lose the spotter observation at the critical window." Callum absorbed this with a terrible stillness she had seen in him before. The jaw, the hands, the color below the temple. "He's going to try to break our observation pair," she said. "Not eliminate us. Disrupt us at the window." "How?" "He doesn't need a shot." She said, "You need to put a round close enough to your position that you instinctively move. One round. It breaks your concealment. It exposes our position to the compound security element. Mission aborts." "He won't miss," Callum said quietly. "He won't shoot to miss," she corrected. "He'll shoot to move you. He knows the protocol. If we take fire, we evade. He doesn't need to hit you. He needs to make you react." Callum looked at her. "What's the counter?" She looked at the ridge, at the geometry, at the rock shelf, the sight lines, the angles. "I need you to be exactly where you are," she said. "Immovable no matter what. Reyes, if you move, we lose the window." She said, "I cannot do this shot without your observation data at the terminal phase. I need your wind call at -15 seconds, TUS 8 seconds, and TUS 2 seconds. Without those calls, I'm shooting blind into a 3-lead thermal gradient at nearly 5 kilometers." She held his eyes. "I need you immovable." Callum looked at the east ridge for a long moment. "He'll put the round within 3 feet of my position," he said, not complaining. "Calculating probably," she said, "to make it convincing enough to produce a reaction. Yes, that's a hell of a risk for me." He was trying to protect his principal rather than complete his own mission center. "Is very good," she said. The words sat between them. "Yes," Callum said finally. "He is a pause was." She said nothing. "Copy." Callum said, "I'm immovable." She believed him, not because she had asked, because she had watched him for 12 days and understood that Derek Callum was underneath the cinder block jaw and the initial dismissal and the 3 combat deployments and everything else. A man who had decided at some point that doing the thing correctly mattered more than doing it comfortably, which meant that when he said immovable, he meant it in the same language she meant precision, not as a goal, but as a description of who he was. 3 hours to the window. She chambered around. The click of the bolt was clean and exact in the cold air. Callum went back to his scope. The mountain breathed around them, slow and vast and entirely indifferent. 18 hours, 12 minutes to the window. The wind was running at 11 miles per hour from the northwest, consistent with the previous 40 minutes of log data. The thermal gradient was stable between layers. The transition zone slightly lower than home morning model, which she had corrected for. The chimney pulse had run at 152, which meant the next pulse was due at 1542. The window opened at 1530. She had 12 minutes of clean air before the pulse. Then the pulse ran 90 seconds, then clean air again for the remainder of the window. She needed him in the first 12 minutes. The behavioral data said he typically crossed at 1532 to 1538. 6-minute habitual window within the 40-minute exposure window. If the pattern held, the chimney pulse would not be a factor. She breathed. She waited. Callum was at the spot cope, completely still watching the compound. He had not spoken in 40 minutes. At 1524, Dilroy fired. The round hit the rock face 14 in from Callum's right shoulder. The impact sound reached her a fraction of a second after the distant crack of a discharge. The temporal gap that told her the round had come from the east ridge at approximately the range she had estimated. Callum did not move, not a flinch, not a shift. He pressed himself fractionally flatter against the rock, an involuntary compression that was not retreat, just physics, and held his position with everything he had. She did not look at him. She did not look at the east ridge. She looked downrange. "Compound gate," Callum said, his voice perfectly controlled. "Movement east structure door opening." "Copy," she said. SS single figure checking. She steadied on the compound. Distance to the courtyard center 4,847 m. Wind call northwest at 11. Holding. Thermal gradient stable. Chimney pulse 14 minutes out. Plenty of time. Confirmed principal. Callum said, gate area moving toward courtyard center, standard pace. Her heart rate was 43 beats per minute. She exhaled, found a natural respiratory pause. Held to minus 15 seconds. Callum said wind holding 11 steady. No shift. She had the sight picture. She held it. T minus 8. Wind holding. Is it at courtyard center? Is stopped. Up brief pause. Phone check. Standard. Phone check. The 3 to 5 second pause. The behavioral data had noted. He was giving her the shot. T minus 2. Wind steady. Clean. Hey, your shot. She did not think. The body did what the years of training had built it to do. Not a reflex, but something deeper than reflex. Something in the architecture of muscle and nerve and trained perception that existed below conscious thought. She fired. The muzzle brake redirected the combustion gases. The rifle recoiled into her shoulder. A known managed force absorbed and returned to position. The round left the muzzle at 2,911 foot pulse, already beginning the 4,847 m journey through 3 distinct layers of complex mountain. A silence. She held the sight picture. The round's flight time at that distance was approximately 6.22 seconds. She counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Silence. Then Callum, in a voice entirely empty. She did not move, did not exhale, did not break position because there was a second target. And she had 14 seconds before he would be gone. This was the part that had not been in the official mission parameters. She had identified it in the signals traffic 6 days ago and had said nothing to Voss because what she had identified was not a second HVT. It was a second opportunity, a specific narrow tactically available window, and it was not for Nazar's logistics coordinator or anyone in the compound. It was for a vehicle, specifically a communications vehicle parked in a vehicle shelter at the compound's northeast corner, which the signals intelligence had identified as a relay point for the entire network's regional communication architecture. Not the man, the infrastructure. Destroying the communications relay would not end the network. Nothing ended networks cleanly, but it would set the regional operations back 6 to 18 months according to the intelligence assessment and would prevent the 48-hour Bose transmission that Nazaro's organization used to transfer operational data upon the death of a keynote. In other words, killing only Nazarov would trigger a data dump within 48 hours. Killing Narev and the communications relay simultaneously would prevent the dump. Vuz had not authorized a second shot. She had not asked. She shifted. 14 seconds had passed. The vehicle shelter was 11 degrees left and slightly elevated from the courtyard center. A shift of approximately 63 m at the target range. She was rearranging in real time. The night 4 scope tracking, the turret adjustments made in the compressed time of trained hands moving without conscious instruction. Callum, to his absolute credit, did not ask a single question. He shifted the spot cope, found the vehicle shelter. Vehicle shelter northeast corner, he said. Communications vehicle confirmed a position. 11 seconds. She rearranged 4,861 m to the vehicle shelter. 14 m more than the primary target. Wind unchanged. Thermal gradient unchanged. Chim pole still 12 minutes out. Rearranged. Dialed 8 seconds. She found the sight picture. The communications vehicle was a modified military transport with the antenna array on the roof, a specific identifiable structure that contained the relay hardware. She was not aiming at the vehicle. She was aiming at the antenna base where the relay hardware connected to the power and transmission systems. A 50 caliber round through that junction at this distance would not destroy the vehicle. It would destroy the relay. 6 seconds. She exhaled, found the pause, fired. The flight time was 6.4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Silence. Impact. Callum said. His voice had changed. Not in volume, in texture. Something had entered it that she would spend a long time afterward trying to name. Relay antenna. Secondary confirmed. She released a breath she had been holding for 12 seconds. The wind continued. The mountain continued. Somewhere on the east ridge, Marcus Dilroy was lying behind a rifle he had not fired again and processing the data that was coming in from the compound. The confirmation of 2 shots, 2 impacts from a position he had not been able to neutralize. She had heard nothing more from the East Ridge after that single warning shot at 1524. She could not look at it now. She began the methodical practice process of preparing to exfil, clearing the position, breaking down equipment, returning everything to the packs in the specific order that had been established in training, the order that minimized time and minimized noise and minimized the evidence of presence. Callum was beside her, doing the same, still without words. It was when they were 2 minutes from complete position clearance that the radio crackled and Voss's voice came through the encrypted channel, low and controlled, and carrying something beneath the control that was not quite emotion, but was adjacent to it. "Reyes," he said, "sir. 2 confirmed impacts, 48-47 and 48-61. "Yes, sir." A pause. The second shot was not in the mission parameters. "No, sir." A longer pause. It prevented the 48-hour data dump. "Yes, sir." The silence on the channel stretched for 3 full seconds. "Your grandfather," Voss said quietly. "Changen." "Sir, get out of there, Sergeant." "Already moving, sir." She closed the radio channel, shouldered the pack, and followed Callum into the approach terrain. Behind her, the rock depression that had been her home for 48 hours was already becoming invisible. Just rock and dust and cold air, indifferent and clean. On the East Ridge, nothing moved. She had been half expecting a second communication from that direction. She had been wrong. The communication came 3 days later. After this field, after the debrief, after the 4 to 7 minutes in Voss's office where the official record was being written and the unofficial record, the one that contained the second shot, the chimney pulse calculation, the position change that had kept Dacroy from disrupting the observation, was also being written in careful parallel. It came in the form of a folded paper left in the equipment shed at the base. No envelope. 2 lines in handwriting she had never seen, but immediately recognized by its character. Precise, angular, controlled. It said he taught us both the same thing. We chose differently. The distance was honest about which choice was right. MD. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her left breast pocket alongside the journal, alongside the letter she had carried for 7 years without opening. She stood in the equipment shed for a moment holding both. Then she opened the letter. She had expected in some part of herself, she had not examined carefully that the letter would contain something dramatic. A final message, a confession, a long philosophical statement about the nature of what he had spent his life doing. It was 4 sentences in her grandfather's careful angular hand on paper that had yellowed at the edges in the 7 years since he had written it. The letter read, "Maya, distance is honest. What I mean is this. The truth of a thing is always at the far end of what most people are willing to look at. You're always willing to look further. Don't stop, grandfather." She read it once, then she read it again. Then she stood with it in the cold equipment shed with a smell of solvent and metal around her for a long time. When she came out, Callum was leaning against the wall outside waiting. He looked at her. She looked at him. "The letter?" he asked. "Yes. Good news." "It was nothing I didn't already know," she said. "That made it the best possible news." He almost smiled. "Almost. Copy that." The Ash matter did not resolve with a confrontation. It resolved the way Voss had suggested it would, which was the way these things always resolve when they were handled correctly, not with force, but with a specific public, irreversible weight of truth. Voss had in the 9 days while Mia and Callum were preparing for and executing the insertion been running his own parallel operation. The signals intelligence that Maya had flagged the domestic coordination address on the Fort Bragg installation network had been the thread. Voss had pulled it carefully, methodically with the patience of a man who had been doing this for 22 years and understood that pulling a thread too fast destroyed the evidence along with the problem. He had found what she had suspected. Ash, the 11 years, the payments, the 3 phone calls from a personal device that was not clean. Ash had 1 moment of near humanity, which Voss described to her afterward with a careful neutrality of a man reporting facts. When the investigative team had arrived at his office, Ashby had sat behind his desk for 40 seconds without moving, looking at the documentation they placed in front of him, and then had quietly put his hands on the desk and said, "I have a family." It was not an excuse. It was not a defense. It was the only true thing he said in the entire subsequent process. A man reduced in a moment of exposure to the single smallest thing he was actually afraid of losing. The exposure itself was not dramatic. It was a recorded conversation. 3 of them, in fact, played on an open channel during a meeting of the Oversight Committee to which Ash belonged. Veza played them without comment. Ash had recognized his own voice immediately and had said nothing for the remaining 3 to 7 minutes of the meeting. Maya was not in the room. She had not been asked to be. She was in the equipment shed cleaning the Barrett when Voss called to tell her it was done. "Your records," Voss said, "have been updated." Both shots both confirmed. "Sir, the assessment of the second engagement will reflect that it was within the doctrinal authority of the assigned shooter based on real-time tactical intelligence not available at the time of the mission briefing." She understood what he was telling her, not just about the record, about the argument, the one that had been running since 1951, about unauthorized acts and authorized decisions, and the line between them that every generation of soldiers had to find for themselves. "Thank you, sir," she said. "Don't thank me." Vu said it's what the record reflects. The record is honest. She almost smiled. She thought he could hear it because there was a brief pause before he disconnected. She finished cleaning the Barrett, set it in the case, closed the latches. Outside, the temperature was 34 degrees, and there was a light wind from the northwest at 8 miles per hour. She noted it, and for the first time in 11 days, she noted it with no operational purpose. Just the truth of it. 3 months felt like 3 years, or rather 3 months felt like the exact right amount of time, which made it feel longer than it was because the right amount of time is always longer than you expect. She had spent it in training, first recovering, then debriefing, then the formal process of her new assignment, which had been offered 6 weeks after the Corrali debrief, and which she had accepted without hesitation. Not because it was a promotion, though it was. Not because it was a validation, though it was that too, because it was the next thing. And the next thing was what came after you did the thing you had been building toward. Not an ending, but a door. The room smelled like fresh paint and old coffee. And there were 9 of them, 7 men and 2 women, sitting in the configuration of people who were trying not to look as new as they were, which meant they were very new indeed. They had the particular alertness of candidates who had made it far enough to be here, but had not yet made it far enough to know exactly what being here meant. Maya Reyes stood at the front of the room with the Barrett case leaning against the wall behind her and the journal in her left breast pocket and the Night 4 scope on the table in front of her. She was 26 years old, and she had just set a confirmed engagement record that the official documentation described in the specific bloodless language of operational archives, and she was about to teach. She looked at them for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Who here has put 1,200 rounds through a 50 calories at distances above a mile?" "Free hands." "Good," she said. "The 9 of you together have a combined long-range background that will be useful in maybe 40% of what I'm going to ask you to do." She paused. "The other 60% doesn't come from rounds downrange." She let them sit with that. "Before we talk about the rifle," she said, "we're going to talk about what comes before the rifle. The preparation, the patience, the 60% that nobody photographs and nobody cites in the record books." She picked up the Night 4 scope from the table, turned it in her hands. "Most of you came through an assessment process that tested your shooting. It was designed to, but the assessment wasn't really about shooting." One of them, a young man in the second row, dark-haired with the elate, slightly forward-leaning posture of someone who asked good questions and knew it, said, "What was it about?" She looked at him. "What's your name?" "Specialist Chen." "What do you think it was about, Sean?" He considered carefully, which she noted as promising. "Discipline under boredom." "Close," she said. "Keep going. The ability to wait without deteriorating." "Closer." She set the scope down. "Here's what it was about. It was about finding out whether you understand that the rifle is the last thing." She paused. "The decision is everything. The patience is everything. The preparation is everything. The rifle is just the result of all that rendered in one very small action at the end of a very long process." She looked around the room. If you came here to shoot, you came to the wrong class. Silence. The 9 of them absorbing this. Then Chin raised his hand again. With respect, you set the record at Karali because you could make that shot. If the preparation was everything, then anyone with the right preparation could have done it. But they couldn't. So isn't the shot itself. The shot itself, she said, is the evidence that the preparation worked. That's all it is. She looked at him steadily. You want to know if talent matters? Whether some people are just born with it, whether the preparation would have been enough without the ability. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The room was very still. My grandfather was the most talented shooter I ever knew, she said. He had the natural instincts that most people never develop. And he used to say she touched the left breast pocket of her jacket briefly. The familiar pressure of the journal. He used to say that distance is honest, that everything else lies to you, but distance never does. Chun waited. The rest of the room waited. What he meant, she said, is that the truth of a thing is always at the far end of what most people are willing to look at. The real range, the real conditions, the real difficulty. Most people stop looking before they get there, because it's uncomfortable to keep looking when what you see keeps getting harder. She looked around the room, meeting each face. Talent gets you to the range where the looking starts. Preparation is what you do when you get there. And wisdom, the kind that takes a long time and costs something. Wisdom is what you use when the conditions tee out to be more complex than anyone modeled. She looked at Chun. The shot at Kerala, she said, required all 3. And of those 3, the talent was the part one was born with, and the part one had the least control over. She paused. The preparation was the part one chose. And the wisdom, the part about the chimney pulse and the north face approach, and the second shot that wasn't in the parameters, she stopped. That part came from a man who made an unauthorized shot outside a village in Korea in 1951 and spent the rest of his life thinking about what it meant. The room was very quiet. So when you ask if a shot is what matters, she said, the answer is the shot matters because everything before it mattered. Take away the preparation and you don't get the shot. But take away the talent and you also don't get the shot. And take away the wisdom of everyone who came before you. Every hard decision and every controversial choice and every lesson learned at cost. Take that away. She looked at Chin steadily. And you're just someone with a very expensive rifle standing in the wind. Chin nodded slowly. The kind of nod that means more than agreement. It means something has shifted. She picked up the night for scope again, held it up so they could see it. This scope was purchased in 1971. She said it has been through Korea and San Marcos and Fort Bragg in Cali province. The glass is still perfect. She set it down carefully. That's what consistent maintenance and deliberate use looks like over 50 years. Your instincts are the glass. Your training is the maintenance. She paused. Don't let either one go unmaintained. She looked at them. Tomorrow we're going to start with wind reading, she said. Not instruments, not models. Your face and your hands in 4 to 5 minutes in an open field until you start to feel the difference between an 8 miles per hour wind and a 9 mile perf wind without looking at a gauge. She paused. Most of you will hate it. A small ripple of something that was almost laughter. Good, she said. That means it's working. She picked up the Barrett case and leaned it against her leg, the old familiar weight of it. Outside the window of the training room, the mid-morning light was the clear, flat light of a day without weather. The kind of day that felt like a pause before something. Not threatening, just waiting. She felt it the way she felt all weather. Present specific noted. 22 meters per second. North and northwest, clear sky, barometric pressure holding. A good day for everything that came before shot. She dismissed them to break. Watched them file out, talking in the low, directed tones of people who had been given something to think about and were already thinking about it. Watched Chin pause at the door and look back at her for a moment with an expression she recognized. Not from a mirror, but from memory, from a porch in San Marcos, from a 15-year-old girl watching an old man hit a rusted drum at 800 yards without adjusting his scope. The look of someone who had just understood something they were going to spend years learning to use. She waited until they had all gone. Then she stood alone in the training room with a Barrett and the scope and the smell of fresh paint and old coffee. And she reached into her left breast pocket and took out the journal. She opened it to the passage she had underlined in pencil. Read it once, touch the underline with one finger. The soft groove of the graphite worn smooth by years of return visits. Distance is honest. Everything else lies to you. Distance never does. She understood it differently now than she had when she first read it at 19, and differently than she had understood it at 22, and differently than she had understood it in Kerala province. With her face pressed against the rock and the wind reading itself on her skin, she understood it now as something larger than shooting. She understood it as a principle for looking at anything true. A relationship, a decision, a legacy, a choice made without authorization in a field in Korea that 40 years of argument had not managed to invalidate. The truth was always at the far end. Most people didn't look that far. They stopped somewhere comfortable, somewhere the distance was manageable, somewhere the air was simple and the thermal gradients were already modeled. She closed the journal, pressed it back in her breast pocket against her ribs, warm from her body, solid. She picked up the Barrett and walked to the door of the training room. At the threshold, she paused, looked back at the empty room, the chairs, the table, the scope she had set down, the morning light coming through the window at the specific angle that made the dust modes visible. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then very quietly to no one in the room and to someone who was not in any room. "I know what you meant now," she said. "I think you knew I would." She stepped through the door. Behind her, the dust mows turned in the light, slow and unhurried in air that was moving at exactly the speed it needed to move. The journal was warm. The scope was waiting. The next class started in 4 hours. And somewhere past the visible horizon, past the far end of what was easy to look at, there was a distance that was not yet known, a calculation not yet begun, an air mass not yet felt on her face. She would find it. She would learn it. She always did. The record at Cali province for 1,847 m confirmed. Dual impact remained on the official record without asterisk or qualification. It was noted in the operational archive with one line of context appended by Commander Harlan Voss himself filed alongside the original Chonjin file from 1951. Engagement executed within operational parameters by Sergeant Maya Reyes. Method application of inherited doctrine under novel conditions. Conclusion. The doctrine remains valid. So does the instinct. Below that in Voss's handwriting, a single additional note. See also Reyes, E. Corporal 1951. The argument is over. The folder was closed. The record was sealed. The distance was honest. For hours later, the second class began. They were different from a morning group in the way that all second classes are different. Slightly less performative, slightly more watchful. Having heard something through the hallway channels that made them arrive with a different quality of attention. Not better, not worse, just different in the way that went from a different direction, carries different information even at the same speed. There were 11 of them this time. Maya noted it. Noted also the one who sat apart from the others, not in the back, which would have been avoidance, but to the far left by the window, in a position that gave them a sight line to both the door and the front of the room simultaneously. Tactical seating, unconscious probably, but tactical. She noted it the way, she noted everything, filed it, moved on. She had set up the Barrett on the table this time, not in its case, but fully assembled. Bipod deployed, the night four-scope mounted and catching the afternoon light. It was not a demonstration prop. It was a presence. She had learned in the weeks since she had started teaching that the rifle in the room changed the room's quality of attention in a way that nothing else did. It made the abstract concrete. It made the distant immediate. It sat on the table and said, "This is real." She let them look at it for a full 30 seconds before she spoke. 4 to 7 attempts, she said, in the last 6 years in the Special Operations Community and Allied Forces. 4 to 7 attempts at confirmed engagements above 4,000 m in operational conditions, not range, not controlled environment, field conditions. She paused. How many confirmed? Silence. They were doing math, guessing one, she said, until Karali. She let that sit. The question I want you to think about, she said, is not why 4 to 6 failed. The question is what the 4 to 6 had in common that the 1 did not. She looked around the room. And before you answer that, because I can see some of you already have an answer, I want to tell you that the answer is not equipment, and it is not natural talent, and it is not even training, though training is closer. She walked to the window, stood beside the person who had chosen the tactical seat, a young woman, early 20s, with the compact, deliberate stillness of someone who had been sitting in difficult positions for a long time and had made peace with it. She did not look at Maya directly, which was itself a form of attention. "What's your name?" Maya asked. "Private Okafor. Why did you sit?" "Hey." Okafor looked at her. A brief pause. The calculation of honesty versus performance. She chose honesty. Best visibility to what? Everything. Okafor said. Maya nodded. "That's the answer," she said to the room. "Not to my question, to a different question. But file it." She walked back to the front, stood beside the rifle without touching it. The 4 to 6 failures had one thing in common. She said they were all working from a model that was built somewhere else. Weather data from a regional station. Ballistic solutions from a standard external model. Wind call from a sensor array that was placed at the observation position, not between the shooter and the target. She paused. They were solving for a situation they had modeled in advance. And the situation disagreed with the model. She touched the scope with one finger. A brief, familiar contact. "The air doesn't care about your model." She said, "The air is doing what the air does. And your model is a guess that you've dressed up in mathematics to make it feel like certainty. It isn't certainty. It's a starting point." She looked at them. The job, the real job, the 60%, is to update the model in real time from the actual conditions with your body as the primary sensor until the model and the reality are close enough that the remaining error is within what the round can absorb. Chin was not in this class, but his question from the morning had stayed with her. Or rather, the answer she had given had stayed with her, the way answers sometimes do when you find them in the act of speaking them rather than in advance. The truth of a thing is always at the far end of what most people are willing to look at. She had said it as an explanation of her grandfather's meaning. She was still unpacking it herself. "I want to tell you something," she said, "that is not in any manual and is not going to appear on any assessment rubric." She paused, choosing the words carefully, not because she was unsure of them, but because they were the kind of words that needed precise placement to land correctly. "Every shot I have ever taken that mattered was taken at the far edge of what I believed was possible at that moment, not past it, the edge. And the only reason I knew where the edge was, the real edge, not the comfortable estimate, was because I had spent time past the edge in training, in preparation, in the deliberate practice of going further than necessary, so that when the moment came, the necessary was familiar." Okafor by the window had turned to face her fully now. The tactical awareness of her position redirected toward this specific target. "You can't find the edge," Maya continued. "From inside the comfortable range, you have to go to the edge and past it. In practice, in controlled conditions, in the environment where failure costs you a bruised ego and not a mission, you go past it until the edge becomes the new center. Then you find the new edge." She looked at each of them in turn. That is what the preparation is. That is the 60%, not repetition, expansion. A hand in the third row. A stocky young man with a weathered complexion of someone who had grown up outdoors. "Corporal Erickson, what happens when you reach the real edge?" "The actual limit of what?" she asked. "Of what's physically possible. The maximum range? The conditions that can't be corrected for when you reach the point where no amount of preparation changes the math." She looked at him for a moment. It was a good question. It was in fact the question she had been sitting with since Karali. Not in doubt, but in the way you sit with something that has changed the shape of your understanding without fully resolving. "You haven't reached it yet," she said. "With respect, there's a physical limit. The ballistics are floor," she said, "not a ceiling." She paused. Every confirmed engagement record in history was at the moment before it was set considered to be at or past the physical limit by people with excellent math and correct models. She let that land. The limit moved. It always moves because the limit isn't in the physics. The physics are fixed. The limit is in the preparation, in the knowledge of the local conditions, in the quality of the model and the honesty of the person building it. Erickson absorbed this. So, there's no actual ceiling. There's a ceiling, she said. "I just haven't found it yet." A pause. "And neither have any of you." Something moved through the room. Not quite excitement, but the cousin of excitement, the feeling of his space expanding. She let it breathe for a moment. Then she picked up the Barrett, unloaded, and handed it to the person in the front row, a young man who took it with a careful reverence of someone receiving something they had been told was significant. "Pass it down," she said. "Handle it. Feel how it's balanced. Notice where your body compensates for the weight distribution." She watched them handle it one by one, passing it left to right through the row. Each pair of hands slightly different in how they held it and how they managed its weight. The rifle will tell you something about yourself every time you hold it. If you're paying attention, what it tells you is where you're compensating, where you're tense, where you're working around something instead of through it. She watched Okafor receive it last by the window. The young woman held it with both hands, her back straight, and she did something none of the others had done. She raised it slightly, just a few inches, and looked through the scope of the wall across the room without mounting it properly. Just seeing what the world looked like from behind that glass. She held it for 4 seconds. Then she passed it back. "Okay, what did you see?" A pause. "Everything was closer," Okafor said, "and also smaller." Ma looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once. "Write that down," she said to the room. What she just said, because that is the entire paradox of this work in 8 words. She paused. The scope brings the target closer. It also reveals how small you are in relation to the distance. She let the silence hold it. And the job, every single time, no matter how experienced you get, is to be comfortable with both of those truths simultaneously. The afternoon light had moved while she was talking. The shaft of it through the window, shifting from the table surface to the floor, the way light moved in the hour before it began to fade. The dust modes were still turning. The Barrett was back in her hands, and she set on the table again with a familiar economy of motion that was no longer conscious, just the body doing what years had built it to do. She looked at them. 11 faces, 11 distinct qualities of attention, all of them directed at her in a specific way. That meant they were not just listening to what she was saying, but trying to understand what she was not saying, which meant they were already learning the right things. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start at 0500. Dress for the field. We're going to spend 3 hours in conditions that will be uncomfortable, and I'm going to ask you to do nothing except lie still and pay attention." She paused. "Most of you will find it harder than any physical training you've done. The ones that don't find it hard are the ones I'm most interested in." She looked at Okafor, and "I want you in the front position tomorrow." Okafor met her eyes, nodded once. Maya dismissed them, stood alone again in the room as the light continued its slow, patient decline toward evening. Outside the window, the base was running its late afternoon rhythms, vehicles, distant voices, the mechanical sounds of equipment being moved and maintained. The ordinary sounds of a place where extraordinary things were being prepared for. She stood with one hand resting on the Barrett's receiver, not gripping it, just present. The way you rested a hand on the shoulder of something you trusted. She thought about Okafor's 8 words. Everything was closer and also smaller. She thought about her grandfather in a field in Korea. Looking through the scope of a rifle, he had maintained himself at a man on a ridge with a telephone, understanding in 11 minutes what a battalion had missed for 3 days. Everything closer, everything smaller. She thought about Marcus D. Croix lying on a rock shelf on the east ridge of a mountain in Kerala province behind the same doctrine and the same philosophy and the same foundational understanding. Everything closer, everything smaller, and using it in service of something that the distance itself had ultimately judged. Distance is honest. She pressed her hand to her left breast pocket, felt the journal, felt the folded letter inside it now. Her grandfather's 4 sentences returned to the journal where they had always belonged. The distance was honest about everything, about the shot, about the choice, about the 4 to 7 attempts, and the one that worked and what separated them, which was not talent alone and not training alone and not any single quality, but the accumulation of all of them over time, maintained and expanded and tested past the comfortable edge until the edge became the center and the new edge was found. She lifted her hand from the rifle, walked to the door, paused with her hand on the frame. The same pause as before. The same threshold. The same room becoming empty behind her. Tomorrow's 0500 call day. The field 11 people learning to lie still and listen to what the world was doing around them before they asked it to let them act. She stepped through. The light finished its movement across the floor. The dust turned. The air in the room settled back into itself, quiet and patient. Outside somewhere at the edge of the base's eastern perimeter, the wind was running at 7 miles per hour from the northwest, and there was a pressure change coming in from the coast that would bring cloud cover by morning. Low cloud, the kind that diffused light without eliminating it, the kind that made distances look slightly different than they were and required a specific kind of knowing to correct for. She felt it on her way across the quad, noted the direction, noted the speed, noted the pressure change in the way her body had learned to note it. In the small, quiet recalibration of everything she knew about tomorrow, she noted it, and she was